Hello, good evening. Thank you for joining. My name is Panayota Papadopoulos, and my role here at Turning Point is a training and education advocate. We are super grateful for you joining us this evening. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the basics of domestic and intimate partner abuse, what we do here at Turning Point, as well as the intersection of how that relates with digital abuse and what that might look like. So this is something that is unique. We haven't done this before, but it is something that we continue to see increasing over time. As you are joining with us, if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat, or I believe there's a Q&A feature as well that you can use. But again, thank you for joining this evening. I hope that you find this interesting. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I know that usually we take a little time to just let everyone get settled in, but just that we have a lot to get through, so I just want to make sure we have enough time for everything as well as questions. As we go through this evening's information, just some quick guidelines. Please take care of yourself if you need to take a break at any point. I know it's a shorter session, but if you do need to take a break, if anything, is potentially triggering or upsetting, please feel free to do so. Ask questions throughout if you have any questions, and also maintain privacy. If anyone does share anything that is something that maybe they have experienced or they've witnessed of someone close to them, all we ask is that you maintain their privacy. We can always take the lessons with us, but we'll leave the stories here in this conversation. So that being said, as we talk about Turning Point of Lehigh Valley, it's important to understand really what is our mission, what is our goal here at Turning Point. Really, our mission statement is the heart of everything that we do, right? Our mission is to eliminate domestic and intimate partner abuse in the Lehigh Valley through survivor empowerment, community education, and engagement. We do serve both Lehigh County and Northampton County here in the Lehigh Valley. And again, you may see some of this survivor empowerment, community education, and engagement, part of the engagement being today's training. So thank you again for joining if you're with us. So what do you think of when you think of the words domestic and intimate partner abuse? What comes to mind? So if you have a minute and you would like to type in the chat, what do you think of when you think of domestic and intimate partner abuse? A lot of times, pretty typical answers will tend to be things around, yep, any form of control, absolutely. A lot of times the initial response tends to be, physical abuse or emotional abuse, power and control, absolutely. Anything that really kind of creates that power dynamic, that power imbalance between partners. But yeah, absolutely. So really what it does come down to is that power and control dynamic. It's that pattern of coercive, intentional behaviors that unfortunately we know does escalate over time. It doesn't tend to get better, even though a lot of times survivors do hope that it does. And it really, again, comes down to those two words, power and control. The abuse is used as a tactic or multiple tactics to gain or maintain power and control over the other person in the relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in more depth. Unfortunately, right, it can affect anyone and everyone. Does not matter age, gender identity, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, ability status, right? Your faith beliefs does not matter. Anyone can be a survivor of abuse, and as such, we serve all survivors. So that being said, as we talk about what it is, right, who is affected, let's kind of break that down a little bit further. It really comes down to over 1 in 3 women, over 1 in 3 teens, over 1 in 4 men, and over 1 in 3 who identify as LGBTQ+, will experience physical abuse from an intimate partner at some point in their lives. So over 1 in 3 women, over 1 in 4 men, etc., will experience physical abuse at some point in their lives from an intimate partner. So there's a question in the chat. How do we navigate controlling teens' access to smartphones to help avoid potential abuse situations when phones have become an integral part of their social lives? Taking away their device could shut them off from abusers, but also support structures. That is a really good question. Thank you, Jerome. So what I would say is that, and it's hard too as a parent and sometimes, or even as as an educator, as someone who might be involved in the life of a child, to do these things, because sometimes you could also argue that in trying to control their access, we're also controlling the child, right? So it's really a fine line to balance. I think that there needs to be a level of structure put in place and expectations, kind of like, if we're in a workplace, there's certain expectations to not overusing our personal technology in those situations. I think the same thing with teens. It's not so much a matter of controlling, but as structuring their access so that they are protected and safe, but also not limiting their connection to support structures. I think, in this post-COVID world, it also, we have relied very heavily on technology, right? As we're having this virtual training at the same time. So clearly we're an obvious example of this. But I think also in some ways, maybe encouraging teens to reconnect in interpersonal ways. How can we regroup those support structures in ways where kids still feel comfortable and still feel like they can be themselves, but maybe also putting them, in small doses in more of those interpersonal settings where they're still safe, it's still a structured environment, but helps keep them safe from potential abuse. I think another big piece to all of this, and I could go on this question for a while. I think another big piece too is, as adults, I think we have a big responsibility to being a safe adult for that kid. That if they are experiencing abuse and we aren't necessarily the safest adult, or maybe kids don't feel comfortable, feel like they can trust us, a lot of times they're not even going to tell us that what's going on. They're going to go to their peers. So if we can provide that safe environment and be that safe adult where kids know that they can come to us without, shame or judgment or criticism, but be honest about what they're experiencing and what support they do need, I think that really helps build that support structure where it doesn't become a control aspect, but it really is more of that, hey, I just want to support you in making smart decisions. So I hope that helps. That's a really good question. You just threw it right off the bat, so thank you. If you have any other questions throughout, let me know. But as we talk a little bit more about this, what does abuse look like, right? It comes down to a lot of these control tactics. So we did mention a little bit of this digital tactic, right? Sometimes this can look like controlling access to things, isolating, a survivor from their support system, isolating them or excluding them from things that they enjoy, things that bring them joy. It could be emotional abuse, name calling, kind of manipulating or twisting somebody's words, their reality, gaslighting, right? A lot of times what we'll see is this pattern of power and control tactics being used. So this diagram on the screen is what we call the power and control wheel. In the center of the circle, right, there's all of these tactics of abuse that we see on a more regular basis. Sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they're more obvious, but really these are the more common tactics that we will see on a regular basis. If you notice, there's two kind of wheels, right? There's that rim around the main wheel, and those still have tactics of abuse, but there's only two categories in that separate rim, right? It's physical violence and sexual violence. Those two tactics are separate because they don't always appear. Sometimes they appear only once and never again. Sometimes they appear all the time, right? That physical and sexual violence often occurs as a way for the abuser to reinforce the power and control dynamics that are already occurring. So more often than not, the abuser will use some of these other layers of control, right? Denying that the abuse occurred, minimizing, oh, it's not that bad, right? Kind of blaming some external force or some external person, maybe even blaming the survivor, using children as a way to kind of control the survivor, or using some form of privilege, financial status, social status in the community as a way to maintain that control. A lot of times kind of even using public perception of the abuser as a way to control, or of the survivor as a way to control the survivor. So all of these tactics are things that we want to look for on a more regular basis. Unfortunately, also, we mentioned that with abuse, a lot of times it follows a typical cycle, and it does tend to escalate over time. So as mentioned, right, this pattern, it looks more linear, more cyclical on the screen. It may occur that way, it might not, right? But really this is here just as a graphic to get an understanding of what the pattern tends to look like. So in the first phase of the pattern, typically we'll start in the honeymoon phase, right? Which I would argue pretty much all relationships start in that honeymoon phase. You're not looking for somebody that treats you poorly right at the start. You're looking for a really, a partner that seems like the perfect partner, somebody who treats you well, might give you gifts, might be extra complimentary, they make you feel good, right? They appear to be the perfect partner. A lot of times, however, it's really difficult to recognize an abuser right at the start because they're acting in the same way that everyone else typically is. As time goes on, and that we're a little bit past the honeymoon phase, we start to see some tension build up. We might start to see some of these tactics that we just mentioned with, some name calling, some control of money, some control of your social networking and what you do in your free time. Usually the survivor feels like they're walking on eggshells at this point. As time goes on, there is some escalation, some incident. This doesn't have to be a physical or sexual incident. This could just be a verbal fit of rage. Really, again, it is coming down to the abuser trying to reinforce and maintain that level of control over the survivor. As time goes on, right, the abuser will often return and try to reconcile. I didn't mean it, I had a bad day, right? They might start to use some of those tactics that we just mentioned. They might try to deny that the abuse occurred or blame some external factor or even minimize it, right? Let's move on past this, it wasn't that big a deal, and try to get back to this level of calm. Unfortunately, right, as we know, this cycle does tend to continue, and it can make it really challenging for a survivor to leave the situation. So interestingly, right, as we've noticed with digital abuse especially, right, which is the focus of tonight, we have noticed that as we have become more ingrained in using digital technology, it has become even more ingrained in our lives overall, right? Whether good, bad, whatever the case is. So the National Network to End Domestic Violence created this study, and they're one of the studies that we quote this evening. But one of their employees said, privacy is deeply connected to safety, especially for survivors of abuse. We must examine norms around privacy as they exist within intimate relationships, as well as the need for tools that allow us to easily disentangle ourselves from shared accounts. While sharing account access or information can be useful, consent should remain at the core of these decisions. So a lot of times during presentations, I often will get questions along the lines, especially with a parent and child dynamic, as mentioned in Jerome's question. But, like, hey, if I track my child's location, is that abusive because I'm tracking their location? And I think this is a really good point to mention for this, right? Consent should ultimately remain at the core of these decisions. Transparency, communication, right? Whether it be a parent-child dynamic or in the intimate partner abuse dynamic that we tend to work in, right? really consent should be at the core of all of these decisions that are made between a partnership. So as we break this study down, right, digital abuse can be very entangled, as mentioned, especially with these shared access points. 85%, according to the study, 85% of people in a committed relationship granted their partner access to at least one of their personal accounts. 85%. And they said, they actually broke it down by demographic, and they said for those who are Gen Z and above, it's 95% had that shared digital access with their intimate partner. However, interestingly, they said 43% of the respondents admitted that they actually felt pressured by their partner to share those logins, those passcodes, or their locations. Again, 43 was about the average. For those who were Gen Z or millennials, it was about 54%. For the older generations, it's not that far off, it's 32%. Interestingly as well, there was no real difference, notable difference between male or female, which comes to tell us that everyone is impacted and vulnerable to potential harm and potential coercion when it comes to digital use. About 30% of individuals have experienced some harmful effect of digital sharing, such as an ex-partner using their accounts to stalk or track them, impersonate them or spy on them, and or noting financial or communication breaches. This actually went all the way up to 45% for those who were millennial or Gen Z generations. They said about 41% have been a victim of a partner's digital abuse, about 41%. However, all this being said, noting that many of them are sharing this digital access and still feel pressured to share, 7 in 10 partners acknowledged that they really felt like they could use some support when it comes to navigating these complexities of digital health, digital well-being, and their digital lives with their intimate partner, right? It's interesting how, quickly over the last 10, 15, 20 years, technology has integrated into our lives that it's almost exploded so fast that we haven't learned how to healthily catch up with it. So a lot of people do recognize the benefit of realizing they need some support and how to do this in a healthy way. There is a profound intersection, however, between these shared digital dynamics and an intimate partner relationship. That being said, unfortunately, it makes digital abuse that much more prevalent. So according to the Urban Institute, they noted that victims of digital abuse or survivors of digital abuse and harassment are twice as likely to be physically abused, twice as likely to be psychologically abused, and 5 times as likely to be sexually coerced. According to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey of 2016 and 2017, those who reported being stalked by an intimate partner in their lifetime, it was about 1 in 8 women, about 13.5%, and about 1 in 20 men, so about 5.2% of men reported being stalked by an intimate partner. Of those who had been stalked, 80% of stalking survivors reported it was through technology or using a digital means. 80%. So it's, again, it shows all more of the reason to focus on how to have these healthy relationships with digital use, digital technology. So let's kind of break it down. What are some of the specifically digital abuse tactics? And then we'll talk a little bit about how to counteract that. So this is absolutely not a complete list whatsoever, but some of the most common tactics of digital abuse that we tend to see, again, seek to gain that power and control over the survivor, or to cause them substantial emotional distress, or to fear for their own safety or the safety of others, right? So we might see that unwanted or excessive calls, texts, just contact overall. We might see unwanted emails, excessive social media messages, A lot of times we'll see the abuser monitoring or going through their social media or their technological devices without their consent. They might threaten to post personal info online or post personal info online. They might spy on or monitor the survivor's activities using technology. They might track locations with the technology or with some sort of tracking app. I think it's also important to note that digital abuse doesn't necessarily only mean with a computer and the internet, right? That this can also include abuse and control around the use of landlines, around the use of TV, around the use of, really any electronical device, so to speak. So even if somebody is not as technologically connected, so to speak, it doesn't mean that they can't still be experiencing forms of digital abuse from their abuser. So how do we counteract this, right? If we're experiencing these sorts of things, it can be very difficult to pull oneself from shared items online, unfortunately. You may have heard the phrase, once it's online, it's online, right? It's not going anywhere. There are applications, there are agencies that do support this, and I'll share some of them before we leave. But number one, right, always use a strong, unique password for your devices and accounts. So securing them, monitoring logins through two-factor authentication, for example, where possible. So, that's when you log into your email and it says, hey, we're going to send a text to your phone number to make sure that it's you, right? That's that two-factor authentication. You want to regularly update your software to protect against security vulnerabilities. Regularly review what devices are logged into your accounts, and make sure that you're, preventing that unauthorized access. I think, especially with social media these days, they make it entirely too complicated to even review some of those things. So if you need help from somebody who maybe is younger or maybe just is more technologically involved, please do so. Please reach out to an advocate. Please check out some of the resources that we're sharing, because I know it can be very complex, and sometimes I wonder if it's intentionally so. But as far as privacy settings, make sure you're reviewing all of your privacy settings. Know who you're sharing these things with. You can always limit who can see your posts, who can see your location or your personal information. You can even create anonymous profiles or use a pseudonym to communicate safely. There are also ways to browse online using either private browsing modes or things like a virtual private network, a VPN, that helps remove any traces of your online activity. You can also clear your browsing history and clear your cookies regularly. I always like clearing my cookies, but that's just me, pun intended. But be cautious about the information you share online, especially your location. Sometimes it can be tricky because even taking pictures sometimes will maintain that location information on your photos. So if you share a photo online now, without even thinking about it, you're sharing your location. So being very careful about those elements and what is being shared or what settings are turned on. Turning off location services when you don't need them is a really good way to not have that location attached to certain things. Checking which apps might have access to your location and adjusting your settings to ensure your privacy. And also just having a support network, right? Reach out to friends, family, trusted organizations, Turning Point, right? Keep someone informed about your situation, especially if you are experiencing digital abuse, to ensure that, you have someone that is aware of what's going on, and that is kind of a safety net, ensuring that you have an advocate, a support person, someone who can ensure that you are safe. So if you are ever in need, we hope you are never experiencing abuse, but if you are, right, services such as Turning Point do exist. All of our services are confidential and are offered at no cost. We have a 24/7 helpline, which really is the entrance point to all of our services. You can call that helpline at any time and, with just general questions about Turning Point, or if you're in crisis and experiencing abuse. We do offer services such as empowerment counseling, which is not like traditional therapy, but our counselors are there to help support survivors through things like safety planning, especially around technology, goal planning, just really supporting their well-being and helping them regain that power and control back into their lives. We also have things such as legal advocacy. So for those who might be seeking a protection from abuse order or a PFA, we do have legal advocates in both Lehigh and Northampton County courthouses that can help support and guide through the legal process. While they can't give legal advice, they can provide referrals for legal support. We also have our Safe House program, an emergency shelter program for any survivor who might be fleeing an abusive situation and or who is in immediate danger from that abuse. We also have housing advocates that can help assist survivors with long-term housing needs. So they can provide those housing assessments and help assess and provide resources to connect them for long-term housing needs. Additionally, we have our training and education team that does things like this to ensure that the community is aware of these concerns, of these situations, of these forms of abuse that are happening, and teaching and empowering the community to help support survivors where they are, because a lot of times it can be really daunting to try to meet with an advocate for the first time or to call a helpline for the first time. So the more educated our community can be in helping initiate that connection, the more supported survivors feel in the community. So that being said, I know this is pretty short. As mentioned, we do have our 24/7 helpline. We also have a variety of different social media outlets. So we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, LinkedIn. We have our own website as well. We are also on YouTube now, which is not on here. So feel free to check us out at Turning Point of LV. And you'll see some of our past webinars as well. There's also the national hotline, which is just thehotline.org, or you can call the number if you have any questions or are not necessarily from this area and you'd like to find out more about your local agency that can provide that support. And there's also this great resource called loveisrespect.org that also has a text line for those teens, young adults in your life that might need that extra supportive resource for their age bracket. Last but not least, here are some digital safety resources that might be beneficial because, you know, they say knowledge is power, right? Staying up to date on the latest digital safety practices and threats can be super important. As mentioned, right, your safety is a priority. And unfortunately, right, we carry our phones, our technology often with us everywhere we go. So ensuring that our digital safety and our physical safety, emotional safety, right, all of the above is a priority, is important. And remember, there are resources and people ready to help you throughout this time. So that is what I have. I'm going to pause. Thank you for joining for this evening.